Excellent job, Mike and not Lee. Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a special edition of Strummin Time Live. I'm your host, Commander Curt, and tonight I have with me a very special guest, Mr. Fred Farley, who is a hydroplane historian. And over the last few years, actually the last almost 30 years, a little over 30 years, Fred Farley has been writing for the UHRA, which used to be the URC, Unlimited Racing Commission. And so he's our special guest tonight on the history of hydroplanes. Fred, welcome to Strummin Time Live.
Glad to be here, Kurt.
Glad you could make it. So tell me about yourself, Fred. How did you get involved in doing hydroplanes and writing about hydroplanes?
Well, I started as a fan, as a small child in Seattle here in 1951, 7 years old. I watched the 1951 Gold Cup on live television, watched Lou Fagel in the Slow Motion 5 win the race, and about 40 years later got to go for a ride in that very same Slow Motion 5. And I joined the Seattle Seafair Race Committee in the early 1960s and joined the Unlimited Racing Commission staff in the 1970s as their historian. I'm still at it 25 years later.
How did you get involved in actually becoming a hydroplane historian? How did you get all that knowledge in your head? Just collected it or what?
Just by going to a lot of races and reading everything I could get my hands on, talking to people, owners, drivers, past participants. It's a fascinating sport.
Now you travel the race circuit itself, and you write articles at at each site about the history of that site, or?
So I travel to about 50%, 50 to 60% of the races. This year I've been to Detroit, Michigan, Evansville, Indiana, Madison, Indiana, Tri-Cities, Washington, Kelowna, and then our race here in Seattle.
Well, welcome to Strummin Time Live, and It's great that you're here. Now, let's go ahead and I'll ask you one more question before we get over to our pictures. You brought in some very gracious pictures. Very nice of you to bring those in. Tell us about what you did before you retired. You were a teacher, is that correct?
Yes, for 20 or 30 years, and I worked in a classroom as a high school teacher, and I always wanted to teach a class on unlimited hydroplanes, but my principal would never allow me.
Oh, darn it. I would have been one of those students because I'm a hydroplane historian myself. A lot of people say I am, but I don't consider myself a hydroplane historian. Nobody like Fred Farley here he's the hydroplane expert. Okay, and you brought along some pictures, so let's go ahead and get right into that, and we're going to take a look at some pictures here of some old hydroplanes. So ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Fred Farley is going to tell us about these hydroplane pictures. So let's go ahead and take a look at those, if we may.
All right.
I see we've got the U-7 there. Go ahead and tell us about that.
Okay, the first hydroplanes look something like this, long and narrow, riding in one or more steps on the underside of the hull. The Hoosier Boy raced in the 1920s in the Madison, Indiana area, used a Liberty engine, and ran speeds of around 60 miles per hour. This particular boat once set a distance record from Cincinnati to Louisville back to Cincinnati, a distance of approximately 260 miles in about 261 minutes, just under 60 miles per hour. In 1924.
So those hydroplanes then were pretty fast in those days for that. What kind of engine did you say that one particular
This one had a
used?
Liberty engine in it, which is similar to the type of power plant that Gar Wood was using in the Miss America boats at that time.
Wow, that's neat. And when did hydroplanes first start? 1903?
Right. There was a major race in Ireland in 1903, the Harmsworth Trophy, and then the American Powerboat Association Gold Cup in 1904 was the American answer to the Harmsworth Trophy. And because the original boats that competed for the Gold Cup were not hydroplanes in the sense that we think of them. They basically plowed through the water rather than skimmed over them. And not until around 1910 did boats start to skim over the water, such as what the Hoosier Boy was able to do.
Wow. Okay, let's take a look at another picture here, if we can. There it is. That's looks like it says the Pepsi 5, but go ahead and tell us about that.
That's the Miss Peps 5, Roman numeral 5. This was in 1947, at a time when commercial sponsorship wasn't outright outlawed, but it was frowned upon. So instead of calling it the Miss Pepsi, they called it the Miss Peps. And this was one of the first generation of three-point hydroplanes. So Miss Peps 5 won the Gold Cup race in 1947 with Danny Foster driving, and was the first Gold Cup winner to use an Allison aircraft engine, which was the type it used in World War II fighter planes.
So let's talk for a second about that. You said sponsorship was outlawed. Why was that?
Because for many years it was considered to be a gentleman's sport, a yachtsman's sport, and then the spiraling costs of running a competitive unlimited hydroplane dictated that sponsorships were necessary, and such as they are today.
Okay, we'll get that in a little bit of slow motion 5, probably getting ahead of myself. But I remember as a little kid, they used to have down in the Stan Sayers pit area, they had this like a big white crane, and they would, in the pit area, would go out, and is that how they lowered the boats down? Is that how they did that?
Yeah, they had a little monorail that they would able to lower the boats in without one of the big cranes, and I don't know why that was taken away a few years back. And now you need these huge, expensive cranes to launch and retrieve the unlimiteds.
Yes, I had to have an interview with one of the crane operators down there, and he told me he's been down there for about 25 years. And anyway, back to the story. Let's not get sidetracked here. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Mr. Hydroplane historian, Mr. Fred Farley, who writes articles for the UHRA, the Unlimited Racing Association. Let's go ahead and take a look at that next picture if we can, and tell us about it.
Oh, Slow Motion 4. The boat that started it all in the Pacific Northwest. Designed and driven by Ted Jones of Seattle. Slow-Mo won the Gold Cup in 1950 at Detroit and brought the race into Seattle for the first time in 1951. And that's how it all began, with this boat. And this Slow Motion 4 is now the property of the the local museum, which is now...
It's all right to say the name of it, because they're a nonprofit organization.
Okay.
They're called what?
Okay, it's the Museum of History and Industry,
That's it.
Mohi, that owns it, but the floor is on indefinite loan right now to the Hydroplane and Raceboat Museum, which is in South Park.
Yes.
On South 93rd Street, and we're open
If
every
you-
Thursday
yeah,
night
if
to
you get a
all day
chance-
Saturday.
If you get a chance to check it out, please do. It's a very nice museum. I've been there, and I'm also associated with it. But okay, you were talking about the Slow Motion 5. Now, also to King Television, I've got some in my archives. King Television wound up inventing the first telescopic not video, but camera from lenses. A guy who worked as a cameraman there wound up taking all these lenses and making them all different shapes, and was able to get focus in on some of those boats. And they invented hydroplane coverage today. Like, it's not like it is today, but for many years. Do you know anything about that?
Oh yeah, so in my early days, before I had a pit pass, I would go down to the races during the week to watch the qualifying. Then I would generally watch the race itself on Sunday on King 5, because of their superior technology, the way they could bring the race literally right into my living room.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk more about boats. You were talking about Slow Motion 4, is it?
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a look at the next picture there.
Okay, Miss Thriftway, another Ted Jones creation. This was the late, great Bill Muncey's first Gold Cup winner in 1956 and 1957. It was the first boat to average 112 miles per hour in competition, in a heat of competition. And it was the first of 3 Miss Thriftways. This particular one, the first one, crashed at Madison, Indiana in 1957. The second Miss Thriftway hit the U.S. Coast Guard boat here in Seattle in 1958. And the third Thriftway was recently restored by the Hydroplane Raceboat Museum. And we've run it several times, and it's the original designer, Ted Jones, says it's in better shape than it was when he first built it in 1959.
Oh, it's a beautiful boat. I had the opportunity to be over there about 2 years ago when they ran it, and not Dan Jones, but he drives a Pico American Dream. Sorry,
Mark Evans.
Mark Evans, thank you, Fred. He gave me an exclusive, and I was able to take a look at that and see it fired up. And there's just nothing quite like it, ladies and gentlemen, to see a hydroplane fired up, and he gets excited. Moving on to, is there anything else about the Miss Thriftway that we need to know about?
No, it had a teammate called the Thriftway 2, which I do not have a photograph with me, but the Thriftway 2 was one of the first boats with the driver sitting ahead of the engine.
Ah.
A concept that was ahead of its time. Didn't catch on for about another 20 years.
Wow. Okay, let's take a look at the next picture if we can, please. And go ahead and tell us about that. There we are.
Shanty 1, a popular Seattle boat of the 1950s, the 1956 Seafair Trophy race winner. Her driver, Colonel Rush Schley, was a 1997 inductee into the Unlimited Hydroplane Hall of Fame. And Colonel Schley, one of the great gentlemen ever associated with this sport.
Uh-huh.
And it was such a pleasure to meet him in person last month for the first time, truly. Well, I had met him as a youngster getting his autograph, but a million kids came up to him in the 1950s and asked his autograph, and me being one of them. And he still looks robust, and I'll bet he could go for a drive right now and be competitive.
How, if I may ask, how old is he?
He's in his 70s,
Really?
unbelievably.
Wow. You know, 2 of the hydroplane drivers I miss is Bill Muncey, who passed away in Acapulco. I'm not sure what the year was. I think it was 1981.
81, yes.
And another guy who really told me a long time ago, years ago, and used to give me a pit pass all the time, was Dean Chenoweth. And when he flipped over, I cried when he passed away. They rushed him to the hospital, and that was sad. There's been many drivers that accidents have happened. What is the most exciting thing that you can remember about we'll take the Seattle Seafair hydroplane race? What's the most exciting moment you can remember? I know you got thousands and hundreds of hours of them. What was your most exciting one that you can think of off the top of your head?
Well, just off the top of my head, in 1973, the classic duel between the Pay and Pack and the Miss Budweiser. Mickey Riemann in the Pay and Pack and Dean Chenoweth in the Miss Budweiser, side by side all afternoon in the driving rain, the mist. Couldn't even see Mercer Island. The weather was horrible, but the competition was superb. And it was right down to the finish line. The winner was in doubt. One of the great races of all time.
Now, let's talk about, you said you had an opportunity. Oh man, I'd tell you there's just nothing. I'm so excited talking about hydroplanes. It's just, ladies and gentlemen, there's just nothing quite like about it. What was it like when you went out in a hydroplane and for that ride for the first time to actually sit there and put the equipment on and actually go out on a hydroplane? What was that like, Fred?
Like nothing I'd ever experienced. It made a roller coaster and seemed as bland as a little kid's merry-go-round. And I had I had a choice of which boat I wanted to ride in. My decision to ride in the Slow Motion 5 was instantaneous because that's the boat that got me hooked back in 1951. It was also the boat that did the complete backward somersault in 1955 with Lou Fagel driving. I tried not to think about that as I climbed into the boat. My girlfriend Carol was with me when I had my ride there at Chelan in 1994. I purposely didn't tell Carol about the flip, and she was worried enough as it was.
You can, I can describe to the viewers, basically I was down in the pits there for 4 or 5 days and this past August 10th. And I'll tell you, to see those hydroplanes just actually fire up and you hear the blum, 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 and the it gets in your blood. And you just, I tell you, it's so exciting, ladies and gentlemen. My blood's boiling right now just talking about hydroplanes.
Well, when it popped up on the 3 points and it was screaming down the backstretch there on the old Apple Cup course on Lake Chelan, we were only going about 115, but it felt like 215. And when I got back to the pits, I was walking on the clouds for hours afterwards.
Wow. Okay, let's take a look at our next picture there, and go ahead and tell us about that, if you would.
Hawaii Kai 3, the Pink Lady. This is my girlfriend's favorite boat. Arguably the finest race boat of the 1950s, designed by Ted Jones and driven by Jack Regis. Hawaii Kai won 5 races in a row in the national championship, and set a mile straightaway record of 187 miles per hour in 1957. The Kai then came out of retirement in 1958 to win the Gold Cup, the crown jewel of boat racing in Seattle's Lake Washington.
Wow, that's the Hawaii Kai, and I've also had the opportunity to, when they were restoring it down at the Hydroplane Museum, to have an opportunity to take a look at exactly how they were restoring it, and I have some footage of that. And in the future, ladies and gentlemen, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to put together a special, hydroplane special, and I'm going to have Fred Farley back because, ladies and gentlemen, we're not done yet. This just popped into my head, and for the record, ladies and gentlemen, right here in public access, you're going to see. I'm going to go ahead and produce a program. So anyway, I'm sorry I got off the track there. I just, you know, we're having so much fun here. Okay, is there anything else about the Hawaii Kai 3 that you want to tell us about?
It was the first boat to win 6 races in a row, and it set records of speed and endurance that stood for many years. Cool. It's arguably the greatest race boat of the 1950s. Okay,
the next boat is?
There's my boat. That's the Slow Motion 5, shown here as Miss Seattle. Okay, it raced from 1951 through 1966. Won 2 Gold Cups in 1951 and 1954, and turned that famous backward somersault on Lake Washington in 1955 with Lou Fagel. And this hull, too, it was restored by the Hydroplane Race Boat Museum. And a couple years ago, we had a little exhibition race on race day morning here at Seattle, and it was Ken Muscatel driving. Slow Motion 5 won the race.
Oh, excellent.
Back in the winner's circle again after many years.
Wow. Well, okay, let's move on to our next boat there. And you're looking at Miss Seattle. What's the next boat, Fred?
It's the Miss US 1.
The Miss US 1, wow. It's a neat...
designed by Dan Arena, who only just recently passed away. It represented Detroit, Michigan from 1957 to 1963. It was driven in this picture by Fred Alter, also driven by Don Wilson.
What kind of engine did it have in that one?
It used a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. In fact, at the end of the 1958 season, this boat borrowed the Rolls Merlin engine from the Hawaii Kai after that team had retired, and won most of the races at the end of the season with the Kai's Rolls engine in it. And this boat in 1962, with Roy Doobie driving, Roy was the crew chief, set the current mile straightaway record of 200.419 that still stands.
Wow. Okay, and moving on to our next boat there.
Such Crust 4 of 1962, one of the biggest unlimited hydroplanes of all time. It's around 34 feet. She carried not one but two Allison aircraft engines, but couldn't quite keep up with the smaller light engine boats. But she was always a colorful craft to have around. She was owned by a wonderful gentleman named Jack Schaefer Sr., and his son Jack Schaefer Jr. drove boats for many, many years. So Such Crust 4 was recently restored and is occasionally displayed, in fact is on display in Detroit these days.
Oh, tell me, does Detroit have I heard rumors that they were planning on opening up a museum back there. Have they done that yet?
They're talking about, they have a facility, and, but the facility that is the best showcase right now is out on Belle Isle at Detroit at the Dawson Great Lakes Museum. That's where the Miss Pepsi is retired. The Miss Pepsi, or the mahogany cigar, or the aqua truck. Driven by the late, great Chuck Thompson, who was one of my boyhood idols. High Point champion in 51 and 52. And it was the last competitive step hydroplane. It was the only unlimited to do justice to twin Allison power, the Miss Pepsi.
Cool. The next picture is the Miss Madison, one of my favorites.
To the world's only community-owned unlimited hydroplane, the host boat for the annual Madison Regatta. Again, and there's no finer place in the world to spend the 4th of July weekend than Madison, Indiana. I plan to move there in a few years.
That's right.
It's a great place to live. Anyway, the Miss Madison, there have been half a dozen boats named Miss Madison. This was the second hull, which raced from 1963 to 1971. Miss Madison achieved immortality when she won the Gold Cup on home waters in Madison, Indiana in 1971 with my good friend Jim McCormick driving.
Wow. Is Jim still alive today?
Jim passed away a couple years ago, and it was like losing a family member.
Yeah. You see, that's one thing, ladies and gentlemen, about hydroplane racing that is really exciting, is that it's a family event, and it's something that if you ever get a chance to go down and see the hydroplane races, please do. Okay, the next picture coming up here is the Chrysler Crew.
Right, one of several attempts at automotive power in the unlimited class. And this particular boat was designed by Henry Lauterbach, who had great success driving and building 7-liter class hydroplanes. Miss Chrysler Crew had used a pair of 426 cubic inch supercharged Chrysler Hemis. It actually won the 1967 Detroit World Championship on the Detroit River with Bill Starrett Sr. driving. And so, well, an oddity in unlimited racing, it's the only boat in the modern era to win a race with automotive power.
Wow. So tell us about the 7-liter engine. When you say 7-liter, that's
about
size?
426 cubic inch piston displacement size. Yes.
Wow. And like you said also too, most of the boats back up until I think it was about 1981 or 82, actually up until about 85 is when the turbines started coming. We'll get into that if we have enough time here in just a second. Our last picture there, let's go ahead and take a look at that. That is
the Miss Bardall.
Oh, a Seattle favorite.
Right, the epitome of the all-conquering Ted Jones hull of the 1960s. See, the Miss Bardall was to the 1960s what Hawaii Kai was to the 1950s. This is a 3-time Gold Cup winner. The Miss Bardall, known affectionately as the Green Dragon, was the first boat to average 116 miles per hour in a heated competition.
Excellent. While we're talking about that, we have just a couple minutes left. What was so neat about the Bardall was that bright color of green. And I remember a couple of things about the Bardall is that the oil, the driver did a commercial for the Miss Bardall. And it was on live television. It was in the pit area. And I remember seeing it. It was 1967, I believe it was. They dumped the oil in there, and then they dumped the other oil, Bardall, in there. And guess what? In an experiment, I saw them do it. It worked. But then when they did it on live television, ladies and gentlemen, the other product worked as good as the other one. So they just went right back to, you know, hydroplane racing, ladies and gentlemen, is a family sporting event, and it's something that's really, really neat. And you know, Fred, it's really exciting. And so, like I said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to have Fred Farley back, and I'm going to sit down with him, and I'm going to produce a program about the history of hydroplanes. And Fred, you are very excellent, and thank you very much for bringing in those pictures with us today. And boy, I tell you, there's nothing quite like hydroplane fever. And Fred, thank you very much for coming in today. I wish we had more time, and in the near future, I think I'll have you back. But like I said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to produce a program about the hydroplane history of hydroplanes. And when were you officially recognized as a hydroplane historian?
In 1973. This is my 25th season.
25th season. And you do this on your own time, or you get paid to do this?
I'm retired from the school teaching, and this is my full-time hobby.
Wow. See, ladies and gentlemen, you see, here at Strummin Time Live, we like to feature a wide variety of music. Well, you see, as we go out of here, we're going to take a look at some more of these pictures and reminisce some more. And Fred, thank you again very much for coming today on Strummin Time Live. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your host, Commander Curt. We'll be back again live next week. And again, Fred Farley, thanks for coming in. Is there any last thing, anything? By the way, what's your girlfriend's name?
Carol.
Carol.
Hi, Carol.
Hello, Carol. How you doing there? Good to see you, and glad you're watching. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go out of here tonight taking another look at some of these hydroplane pictures. If you're a musician, please call that number. And Mike Ranstrom and Bill D will be taking us out of here with another number as we take a look at some of these hydroplanes. And thanks again, Fred, for coming in. It was very enjoyable. I wish we had more time, ladies and gentlemen. Good night. Have a positive week, and we'll see you next week on Strummin Time Live. Thanks, Fred. Oh, I love hydroplanes. Get out and see a hydroplane race sometime. Good night.